There are moments when sport ceases to be a game and becomes something greater. A mirror reflecting who we are, what we fear, and what we believe in. In February 1980, in a small town in upstate New York, 20 young men changed the meaning of courage. They were amateurs, college kids barely out of adolescence, and they faced the greatest hockey team the world had ever seen, the Soviet Union. What unfolded on that frozen stage was more than a game. It was a clash of systems, ideologies, and spirits. It was the night democracy faced discipline, freedom faced control, and belief faced certainty. This is the story of the miracle on ice, when a team of unknown Americans did the impossible, and in doing so, gave a wounded nation something to believe in again. To understand that miracle, we must first go back to a decade of darkness. The 1970s had left America tired. The Vietnam War had divided the country and left deep scars. The Watergate scandal had shattered trust in government. Inflation soared, jobs disappeared, and an oil crisis had left people waiting in endless lines for gasoline. For the first time since the Great Depression, the American dream seemed fragile. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Soviet Union stood powerful and proud. Their hockey team, an extension of the state itself, was invincible. They trained together year-round under a regime that blurred the line between athlete and soldier. For over 2 decades, they had dominated the sport, winning nearly every international title. They didn't just win, they humiliated opponents. When the Winter Olympics approached in 1980, no one expected the U.S. team to stand a chance. How could a roster of college players, most still living in dorms, compete with men who had effectively been professional warriors of the ice? But somewhere between logic and faith, something extraordinary began to form. Herb Brooks, a sharp-minded, stubborn coach from Minnesota, had been given the impossible job of leading the U.S. team. Brooks himself had been the last player cut from the 1960 Olympic squad, the last American team to win gold in hockey. That disappointment burned inside him for 20 years. Now fate had handed him a second chance. Brooks didn't want to assemble the best players, he wanted the right ones. He scouted colleges across the country, looking not for stars but for fighters. Men who could endure pain, discipline, and unity. "I'm not looking for the best players," he told his assistants. "I'm looking for the right players." From Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Michigan came the recruits. Young men with calloused hands, unpolished attitudes, and dreams too small to imagine what was coming. They were fast, raw, and sometimes reckless. But Brooks saw potential. He saw fire. Training camp began in the summer of 1979. It was brutal. Brooks pushed his players beyond exhaustion. He demanded not only physical strength but mental steel. His methods were unconventional, even cruel. When the team played poorly in a European exhibition match, he kept them on the ice after the game, skating line after line, whistle after whistle as the crowd emptied the arena. "Again," he shouted. "Again." Until his assistant, Mike Eruzione, finally snapped and yelled, "I play for the United States of America." Only then did Brooks blow the final whistle. The players began to understand. They were not just representing a team, they were representing an idea, the belief that unity could overcome power. Across the ocean, in the cold gray cities of the Soviet Union, the Red Machine trained in silence. Their coach, Viktor Tikhonov, ruled with an iron will. His players lived in barracks, isolated from families, their lives devoted to hockey and to the motherland. They practiced 11 months of the year, their routines measured to the second. They were not just athletes, they were weapons, crafted to prove the superiority of communism. Among them were legends: Vladislav Tretiak, the world's best goaltender; Boris Mikhailov, the fearless captain; Valery Kharlamov, fast as light, and defensemen who struck like iron. They had crushed NHL professionals, embarrassed Canada's finest, and won 4 consecutive Olympic gold medals. To the world, the Soviets were unstoppable. To the Americans, they were a myth, until they met them face to face. 10 days before the Olympics, the U.S. team played an exhibition match against the Soviets at Madison Square Garden. It was meant to be a test, perhaps a confidence boost. Instead, it was a massacre. The Soviets destroyed the Americans 10-3, skating circles around them, toying with them. The crowd sat silent. Herb Brooks said nothing. He just stared. After the game, Soviet coach Tikhonov said, "They are boys. We are men." The message was clear. This was not a rivalry, it was a ritual execution waiting to happen. The U.S. players returned to their village in Lake Placid humiliated. But Brooks didn't dwell on defeat. He analyzed every mistake, every weakness, every shift of Soviet momentum. "Let them think we're nothing," he told his team. "We'll see who's still standing when it's over." Lake Placid in February 1980 was a quiet, snow-covered town of less than 3,000 people. Small hotels, pine trees, frozen lakes, and an Olympic dream that seemed too big for its setting. But perhaps that was fitting. The greatest underdog story in sports would begin in a place that looked like a postcard. As the games began, the Cold War loomed large. Only months earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. President Jimmy Carter threatened to boycott the upcoming Summer Olympics in Moscow. Americans were angry, fearful, and uncertain of their place in the world. The sight of the Soviet flag flying proudly on U.S. soil was almost unbearable for some. And yet, amid all that tension, 20 young men laced their skates and took the ice with quiet focus. Their journey through the early rounds was not spectacular, but it was steady. They tied Sweden in the opening game, a draw that felt like a victory after scoring in the final seconds. Then they beat Czechoslovakia, Norway, Romania, and West Germany. Each win built confidence, each goal made belief more tangible. Still, everyone knew the inevitable was coming. The Soviet Union, undefeated and unshaken, awaited them in the medal round. In locker rooms and dormitories, the Americans watched tapes of the Soviets moving like a single machine, passes so perfect they seemed rehearsed by nature itself. No one spoke it aloud, but the truth hung in the air. To beat them would require not only perfection but something beyond it. February 22, 1980. 5 p.m. local time. Lake Placid. The arena held barely 8,000 people, but the noise could have filled a continent. Flags waved, faces painted red, white, and blue, hearts pounding like drums. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, the temperature of history began to rise. Herb Brooks paced behind the bench, his jaw tight. In the locker room moments before, he had said only this: "You were born to be here. This is your time. Now go out there and take it." The Soviet players entered with quiet confidence. No smiles, no emotion. They had faced pressure before. For them, this was another game, another victory waiting to be claimed. The puck dropped. Within seconds, the Soviets controlled the ice with mathematical precision. Their passes were sharp, effortless, like a ballet of dominance. The Americans scrambled to keep up. Midway through the first period, the Soviets struck. Goal. 1-0. The red machine had begun to turn. But something inside the Americans refused to bend. Before the period ended, they responded. A rebound goal by Buzz Schneider, the crowd exploding in relief. 1-1. The Soviets, almost insulted, answered immediately. 2-1. The rhythm of inevitability returned. Then, with seconds remaining in the period, came a moment that would set the tone for everything to follow. As time ran out, American forward Mark Johnson chased a loose puck toward the Soviet net. Goaltender Vladislav Tretiak moved to clear it, but Johnson reached it first, slipping it past him as the buzzer sounded. Goal. The crowd erupted like a volcano. 2-2. The Soviets skated to their bench in shock. Tretiak, the greatest goalie in the world, had made a mistake, and Tikhonov, furious, made one of his own. He pulled Tretiak from the game, replacing him with his backup. No one could believe it. Even Soviet players looked confused. Later, Tikhonov would call it the worst decision of his career. The second period began with renewed fire. The Soviets attacked relentlessly, testing the American defense with a barrage of shots. Jim Craig, the U.S. goalie, became a wall of destiny. Pucks ricocheted off pads, posts, and gloves. He moved like a man possessed. But one finally slipped through. 3-2. The Soviets were back in control. When the buzzer sounded for the second intermission, the Americans skated to their bench gasping for air, drenched in sweat. They trailed by 1, but the look in their eyes was different now. They were not afraid. They were believers. As they gathered in the locker room, Herb Brooks looked at them. 20 kids staring back, tired but burning with something fierce. "If you lose this game," he said, "you'll take it to your graves." Then, leaning closer, "Your fucking graves." The room fell silent. Then a nod, a whisper, a rising pulse. They would not lose. The third period began under a pressure few humans ever experience. 20 minutes stood between the young Americans and immortality, and between the Soviets and humiliation they could not comprehend. The air inside the Lake Placid rink was electric, heavy, vibrating. You could feel it in your ribs. Reporters later said they couldn't hear their own thoughts over the chanting. USA, USA. The Soviets, cold and mechanical, skated out first. Their faces were masks of calculation. They had been here before, behind, challenged, even mocked, but never defeated when it mattered. They would simply do what they always did: crush the opposition beneath precision and inevitability. Across the ice, the Americans gathered in a small huddle. Herb Brooks said nothing now. His work was done. His players didn't need strategy, they needed faith. The puck dropped. Almost instantly, the Soviets attacked with machine-like rhythm, their passes slicing the ice into geometry. The Americans bent but did not break. Jim Craig, their goaltender, stood like a man possessed, his body an extension of destiny itself. Then a shift, a small misstep by a Soviet defenseman at center ice. Mark Johnson pounced on it, charging forward, skating as if pulled by fate. He slipped between two red jerseys, drew back his stick and fired. The puck rocketed past the Soviet goalie and into the net. Goal. 3-3. The arena exploded. People screamed, jumped, cried. Flags waved so violently they looked like fire. The Soviets stared in disbelief, their composure cracking for the first time in memory. But the Americans weren't finished. A few minutes later, with 10 minutes left on the clock, a loose puck drifted toward the Soviet blue line. Mike Eruzione, the team captain, a man who'd once sold pizza and driven trucks, gathered it, lifted his stick and shot. The puck curved through the air, slow at first, then faster, sliding just under the goalie's glove and into the net. Goal. 4-3. For a moment, time stopped. Then the crowd erupted into something beyond sound. People shouted until their voices vanished. The announcer's words were lost beneath a thunder that seemed to shake the rafters. On the bench, Herb Brooks didn't move. He folded his arms and stared at the ice, lips pressed tight. Later he'd say, "I didn't want them to think the job was done." But everyone in the building knew, something historic was happening. 10 minutes. That's all that separated 20 amateurs from the greatest upset in sports history. The Soviets, stunned but not defeated, unleashed their fury. They skated faster, hit harder, fired shot after shot. The puck pinged off Craig's pads, off posts, off helmets. The Americans scrambled, blocked, dove, bled. The Soviets outshot them nearly 2-1, but nothing would go through. Every time the puck crossed the American blue line, thousands of voices shouted in unison, "Clear it!" Jim Craig made saves that defied logic, glove saves, kick saves, desperation saves. His eyes darted everywhere, seeing angles others could not. He wasn't just playing hockey, he was fighting for something greater. The minutes melted like snow under fire. 8, 7, 6. The Soviets grew frantic, breaking formation, abandoning the perfect system that had always worked. They hit harder, skated faster, yet the puck refused to obey them. 4 minutes. The Americans couldn't breathe. They clung to survival, to belief. The crowd screamed as if the sheer force of sound could protect the lead. 2 minutes. The Soviets pulled their goalie, sending an extra attacker onto the ice. The Americans collapsed into defense. The puck flew from stick to stick, red jerseys circling like wolves. Then came the final seconds. 10, 9, 8. A Soviet shot slammed off the boards. Craig smothered it. The puck slid to the corner. The Americans tried to clear it. 7, 6, 5. The clock ticked slower now, as if reality itself wanted to stretch the moment. 4, 3. The puck crossed the blue line. Mark Johnson slapped it away. The crowd began counting, their voices a single wave of sound. And then the buzzer. Pandemonium. Players threw their sticks into the air, leaped into each other's arms and collapsed onto the ice in disbelief. Fans climbed the boards, screaming, weeping, waving flags. Herb Brooks, the stoic architect, disappeared down the tunnel, alone, overcome with emotion. In the broadcast booth, commentator Al Michaels shouted the words that would echo through history. "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes. It wasn't just a victory. It was deliverance. The United States had defeated the Soviet Union 4-3. No one in the arena could fully process it. The Soviets stood stunned, their discipline dissolving into confusion. For the first time in 2 decades they looked human. Their machine had been broken by willpower and belief. When the final handshake line formed, some Soviet players refused eye contact. Others, in rare gestures of grace, nodded quietly. They knew what had happened was larger than hockey. The Americans didn't celebrate like champions. They celebrated like children, wild, joyous, disbelieving. They skated laps, embraced each other, clung to the flag that had felt so heavy for so long. But the miracle wasn't over yet. The format of the Olympic tournament meant that one more game remained, against Finland. Only by winning that could the U.S. secure gold. 2 days later, exhausted but unbroken, they faced Finland. After 2 periods they trailed again. Herb Brooks entered the locker room, eyes burning. "If you lose this one," he said, "you'll take it to your fucking graves." They didn't lose. The Americans scored 3 goals in the 3rd period, sealing a 4-2 victory and the gold medal. When the final horn sounded, the arena shook once again, but this time it was different. There was relief, completion, the realization that the miracle was real. On the podium, as the American flag rose and the anthem played, the players sang through tears. Herb Brooks stood at a distance, hands behind his back, watching his boys become legends. For him, the victory was never about revenge or politics. It was about possibility. About proving that heart could rival power, that belief could outlast fear. The Soviet Union's dominance didn't vanish overnight. They would win gold again in later years. But they would never again carry the same aura of invincibility. The world had seen them beaten by ordinary men, and that changed everything. Back in the United States, the impact was immediate and electric. News of the win spread across radio waves and television screens like wildfire. In an era before the internet, people learned the result by word of mouth. Strangers hugging in grocery stores, bartenders shouting across counters, families crying in living rooms. For a country weary from war, scandal, and doubt, that hockey game became a moment of unity. It reminded Americans of who they were when they believed in each other. The timing could not have been more perfect. Just weeks later, President Jimmy Carter would announce the U.S. boycott of the Moscow Summer Olympics, a symbolic stand against Soviet aggression. But for once, America had already won something moral, something pure. The players returned home as heroes. Many had no professional careers ahead of them. Their glory was temporary, but their legacy eternal. Jim Craig carried the American flag around the rink that night, searching the stands for his father, a symbol of the families who had sacrificed everything for that dream. Mike Eruzione never played another competitive game after Lake Placid. He didn't need to. He had already written his chapter in history. The Soviets, meanwhile, returned home in silence. Their coach, Tikhonov, faced harsh criticism, particularly for removing Tretiak from the game. But even in defeat, the Red Machine's greatness was undeniable. Their loss did not destroy them, it humanized them. And perhaps that was the true miracle. For a brief moment, the Cold War found its humanity on a sheet of ice. Historians would later describe the game as a metaphor: freedom against control, chaos against order, faith against certainty. But those who were there said it was simpler than that. It was a group of kids who refused to stop believing. In Lake Placid, the snow kept falling. The Olympic flame flickered in the cold, its reflection shimmering across frozen lakes. The tiny town returned to silence, unaware that its name would forever be spoken with reverence. Years later, when asked what the miracle really meant, Herb Brooks said quietly, "It wasn't a miracle because we won. It was a miracle because we believed we could." And in that belief, the impossible became possible. The morning after the miracle, the sun rose over Lake Placid as if nothing had happened. The snow still fell gently, the air still bit at the skin, and the mountains stood as they always had, ancient, indifferent. Yet, to the people who had witnessed the night before, the world felt new. Inside the Olympic Village, the American players awoke one by one, half convinced it had all been a dream. Their bodies ached, their throats were raw, and their hands were covered in bruises from endless blocked shots. But when they looked out the window and saw the flag still waving, they remembered, it was real. They had beaten the Soviets. There were no champagne bottles, no media blitzes, no luxury suites. Just laughter, disbelief, and the quiet exhaustion of people who had emptied themselves completely. They gathered for breakfast, trading smiles that needed no words. Each man carried a private thought: we did it. We really did it. Across the Atlantic in Moscow, the news hit like a thunderclap. Soviet television, carefully controlled by the state, barely acknowledged the loss. The game had not even been broadcast live. Newspapers printed short, emotionless articles. The USSR team defeated by the United States, 4-3. No photos, no commentary, no analysis. To the regime, it was an anomaly best forgotten. But within the team, the wound cut deep. Coach Viktor Tikhonov isolated himself. He knew his decision to pull Tretiak would haunt him for the rest of his life. For a man who measured existence by perfection, there was no forgiveness. His players returned to the training camp in silence, stripped of pride but still bound by duty. And yet, in their quiet defeat, they too became part of the story, because without the Red Machine there could be no miracle. For the Americans, the days after the victory were a blur. Crowds followed them through the streets of Lake Placid, asking for autographs, shaking hands, crying. Journalists from around the world swarmed the small town, desperate to capture the faces of the young men who had become symbols of hope. But the players seemed almost untouched by fame. They spoke softly, modestly, always deflecting attention from themselves. Herb Brooks remained distant, avoiding the cameras. He had never sought glory, only transformation. His job was done and he preferred to watch from the shadows. The country didn't see him cry that night, but alone in a corridor he did. When the closing ceremony arrived, the United States marched into the stadium carrying the weight of something more than medals. The world applauded them, not just for winning but for reminding everyone why people fall in love with sport in the first place. And then, as the Olympic flame dimmed and the anthem faded, the miracle became legend. Back home, the players returned to ordinary lives. Some joined professional teams. Others retired to careers far from the ice. None of them ever experienced anything like that moment again, nor did they need to. They had touched something eternal. Jim Craig tried the NHL for a while but found his destiny not in rinks but in memories. Mike Eruzione turned down professional offers. His story was complete. Mark Johnson, the scorer of crucial goals, went on to coach future Olympians. They scattered across the country but their bond never broke. They would forever be those boys from Lake Placid. In 1980, America needed heroes, and it found them not in generals or politicians but in skaters. The country had been starved of belief. Vietnam had left scars that still bled. Watergate had turned idealism into cynicism. The economy staggered, and the Cold War loomed like an endless shadow. Then, in one night, everything shifted. For a brief moment, America remembered how to hope. The miracle on ice wasn't just a game, it was a rebirth. In towns and cities across the nation, people poured into streets. Churches rang their bells. Strangers embraced in diners and subway stations. Children ran outside wearing their parents' old jerseys, pretending to be Eruzione, Johnson, Craig. For weeks, it felt as if the whole country had inhaled the same breath of light. The power of that victory transcended politics, but it also transformed it. Less than a year later, the United States elected Ronald Reagan, a man who preached optimism, strength, and renewal. Many historians would later note that the mood of the miracle echoed in the mood of Reagan's America. Proud, confident, reborn. But beneath the flag waving and speeches, something quieter endured, the lesson Herb Brooks had always tried to teach, that greatness isn't born from power but from belief. That unity, not dominance, creates miracles. The Soviets learned from that night too. They analyzed the loss with scientific precision, correcting errors, refining systems. Within 4 years they reclaimed Olympic gold in Sarajevo. But even then something had changed. They had been reminded that sport, like life, cannot be perfectly controlled. Years passed. The Cold War thawed and the Soviet Union dissolved. The Berlin Wall fell and new nations emerged from old empires. The red flag that had flown above Lake Placid no longer existed. Yet the memory of that game, the one night when amateurs defeated giants, remained untouched by time or politics. Decades later, when the United States and Russia met again on Olympic ice, cameras would pan to aging men in the stands, the players of 1980 smiling softly, still remembering the miracle. For the American people, it became more than nostalgia. It became folklore. A story told to children who hadn't been born yet, a parable of belief against odds. It reminded them that sometimes the world's biggest victories are won not by armies or economies, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And it endures because it's universal. Every underdog in every sport, every artist, every dreamer chasing the impossible, they all carry a fragment of Lake Placid inside them. That feeling that maybe, just maybe, you can beat the unbeatable if you dare to believe. In schools, in locker rooms, in corporate offices, Herb Brooks's words are still quoted, "Great moments are born from great opportunity." It's become more than a line from a speech. It's a mantra, a reminder that miracles don't happen to those who wait, they happen to those who work. Time, as it always does, softened the edges of the story. The Cold War ended, the heroes grew old, and the arena itself changed. But the ice remembers. In Lake Placid, the rink still stands. Tourists walk its corridors, touching the boards, whispering the same words they heard on grainy recordings. Do you believe in miracles? The answer after all these years is still yes. In 2002, at the Salt Lake City Olympics, the surviving members of the 1980 team gathered once again. The crowd rose as they entered, gray-haired now, slower, heavier, but glowing with the same quiet pride. Mike Eruzione carried the Olympic torch up to the cauldron, surrounded by his teammates. When the flame burst into life, the stadium roared, not just for nostalgia but for gratitude. It was as if the circle had closed. The boys who once lit the world's imagination were now passing that light forward. Herb Brooks didn't live to see that night. He had died months earlier in a car accident, gone at the age of 66. But when his name was announced, the arena stood in silence. On the giant screen, a photo appeared, Brooks in his familiar plaid jacket, eyes sharp, half-smile on his face. Beneath it, 3 words: "He believed in us." That was the essence of his gift. He had believed, not in miracles but in people. He had seen possibility where others saw limits. And through that belief he had turned a team of amateurs into legends. Even now, decades later, when people speak of the miracle on ice, their voices soften. They remember where they were, what they felt, who they hugged. They remember a night when the impossible became possible, not through luck, but through heart. Because that's what the miracle was, not magic but humanity at its best. In the grand sweep of history it may seem small. One game, one score, one winter night in a tiny arena. But in the hearts of those who watched, it became proof that the world could still surprise itself. That hope, though fragile, is stronger than fear. That unity, though fleeting, is worth chasing. And that sometimes, the purest victories are not about defeating others, but about discovering who we really are. In the quiet after the roar, in the echo of skates on melting ice, that truth remains. The scoreboard in Lake Placid still reads, USA 4, USSR 3. It hangs there not as a relic but as a reminder that belief is the greatest force of all. The lights dim. The ice reflects the memory of 1,000 cheers. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear them again. The crowd counting down, Al Michaels's voice rising, 20 hearts beating as one. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. We always will. History is full of moments like this, when ordinary people do something extraordinary and remind us what we're capable of. The miracle on ice wasn't just about hockey. It was about courage, unity, and belief, the kind of belief that changes the world even for just one night. And these stories, they never end. Every day, across time and across nations, there are new miracles waiting to be remembered. If this story moved you, don't forget to join us again tomorrow for another journey through Olympic history, stories of glory, heartbreak, and the human spirit. Subscribe, share, and keep believing, because the flame of the Olympics never dies, it just waits for the next dream to ignite.